You're tuned in to CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio. This is River Reads, with host and narrator River Wild. A story hour, where those of all ages can escape into bedtime stories and fairy tales, new and old, but mostly old and at times macabre, or silly, or even perhaps a little confusing, as written in Old English, and the host sometimes fumbles the odd word, and then there's those stories whose premise or message has aged poorly. But let's face it, you can't be picky when you're dependent upon copyright-free material available through Creative Commons. So, if you enjoy a narrated story and don't mind a weird tale, let's begin.
River Reads has been recognized as the recipient of a national award, the Broadcast Dialogue's Canadian Radio Awards, winning Best Podcast in the Small Market category.
River Reads is not a kids' show, but is not a kids' show. Listener's discretion is advised.
This week on River Reads, episode 44, Be Wary in the Forest, features 4 tales from the collection Fairy Tales as Retold by Bridget Hathaway, called Puss in Boots, Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and Rapunzel. Gender Blender. Remember to tune in weekly for our Gender Blender segment, where we flip and play with traditional gender roles, reimagining classic fairy tales, only revealing which tale is our Gender Blender tale at the end of each episode. Ooh, the suspense. And now for River Rambles. Hello. I am your host, narrator, River Wild, recording live from under my stairs, aka not really live, I just record that way to cut down on my editing. Forests. So many places to hide. So many things lurking within. Unaware eyes are always watching you. The forest. A dense, dark, unpredictable, and primal space. Undeveloped. Wild. Ancient trees, wide sprawling branches stand sentient in the darkness, blocking out any trace of sunlight. Bark, rough and patchy, looking like bubbling soap frozen in time. Thick clumps of damp moss hang from their decaying limbs in this dusky atmosphere. In an illustrated encyclopedia of traditional symbols, J.C. Cooper writes, "Entering the dark forest or the enchanted forest is a threshold symbol, the soul entering the perils of the unknown, the realm of death, the secrets of nature, or the spiritual world which man must penetrate to find the meaning." Forests, what makes them feel alive? Perhaps enveloped in a haunting veil of mist and strewn with rotting debris, forests stand as mysterious sanctuaries where ghostly and sinister creatures thrive in shadowy secret, whispering stories of forgotten time and awakening a deep primal sense of awe and perhaps unease. It is here, at the edge of the forest, that the light fades as you enter the trees, turning into a strange, dark, and quiet place, where sounds all but vanish, absorbed into the dark. Here, shadows dart about, while unseen creatures move branches, and you sense the unseen eyes watching you. In the thick air, you feel the light breezes' faint whispers all around you, smell the hint of decay, and feel that tense awareness, like anything could happen here at any moment. Let's begin, shall we?
The following is rated GGD, meaning it contains gross gore and/or death.
Listeners' discretion is advised. Little Red Riding Hood, from Fairy Tales, retold by Bridget Hathaway. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother in a cottage on the edge of a large forest. Her grandmother, who doted on her, had made her for her birthday a red velvet bonnet with a tunic to match to wear over her dresses. The child liked the costume so much that she wore it every day wherever she went, until her name was altogether forgotten, and everyone who knew her called her Little Red Riding Hood instead. One day, when she was playing in the garden, her mother called her and told her that she had just baked a cake, which she would like Little Red Riding Hood to take with a bottle of wine to her grandmother, who had fallen ill and had to stay in bed. "As your grandmother is all alone in her house in the forest," she said, "she will be glad of your company, and this cake and the wine will do her good. Tell her I shall come myself a little later on when I am less busy." She wrapped the cake in a cloth and laid it carefully beside the bottle of wine in a basket. "Now see to it," she admonished, "that you don't stray off the path, and don't on any account talk to strangers." Little Red Riding Hood dearly loved her grandmother, so she took the basket and set off eagerly, very proud to be entrusted with such an important errand. She was not often allowed to go so far from her home alone, and heeding what her mother had said, kept close to the path, taking care not to stumble over the sticks and stones as she ran along, humming a little tune to herself. She looked very pretty, with the ribbon of her red bonnet flying out above her long flaxen hair, and around her waist a blue sash, the same colour as the dress that peeped out beneath her beloved red tunic. She had to slow down when she reached the forest itself, where the trees grew thicker and the path more winding, and it was there that she met the wolf. She had never heard of a wolf, and certainly never seen one, and having no notion of their evil cunning, was not the least bit frightened of them. It didn't enter her head that anyone would want to harm such a little thing as herself anyway. "Good morning," said the wolf. "What a pretty Red Riding Hood you're wearing." The child was so pleased to hear this that she immediately forgot what her mother had said about not talking to strangers. She had always been a friendly little girl. "Yes, it is," she replied. "My granny made it for my birthday. She is ill in bed, and I'm on my way to visit her." "And what have you got in your basket, Little Red Riding Hood?" the wolf inquired politely. "A cake my mother baked, and some wine that we hope will make Granny feel better." She held out the basket so that the wolf could have a peek inside. "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" asked the wolf. "She lives in the cottage next to the 3 oak trees in the middle of the forest." "What a tasty little creature she does look," the wolf thought to themselves, unable to keep their hungry eyes off of the child. "How I'd like to eat her up this very minute. But if I'm clever, I shall be able to have both her and her grandmother for my lunch today." So they walked along beside Little Red Riding Hood, making amicable conversations about the beautiful morning and what a lucky little girl she was to be visiting her grandmother, while what they were really up to was trying to think of a way of delaying her so that they could reach the grandmother's house before Little Red Riding Hood did. Suddenly, an idea came to them, and they said, "Look at those lovely strawberries over there, and all those flowers growing under the trees. Would it be nice if you were to pick some to take to your grandmother?" Little Red Riding Hood needed no persuading. She was usually an obedient little girl, but she at once forgot about her promise to her mother not to leave the path. The sunlight flittering through the trees seemed to beckon to her, and all the berries and the flowers looked so tempting that she simply had to pick them. Waving goodbye to the wolf, she disappeared into the forest. Meanwhile, the wolf wasted no time. With a leap and a bound, they made their way straight for the grandmother's cottage by a short-cut, and was soon knocking at the door. "Who is there?" the old lady called out feebly from her bed. "It's Little Red Riding Hood, Granny dear. I've brought you a cake and some wine," said the wolf, trying to imitate the little girl's high-pitched, squeaky voice. "Let yourself in, my dear," replied Grandmother. "I am too weak to get up. Just lift the latch." The wolf quickly opened the door and took a stealthy look around the room. Then, in one great spring, they leaped up onto the grandmother's bed, and before she could let out so much as a whimper, gobbled her up, nightclothes and all, and in a few greedy swallows. Feeling somewhat less ravenous, they bounded across the chest in the corner to where they rummaged until they found another of the old lady's neatly folded nightgown and cap. Slipping these on, they hastily drew the curtains to make the room a shade darker, scrambled back into the bed, and crouched down low between the sheets. Little Red Riding Hood lost all thought of time as she darted about, picking flowers and berries. The ripe strawberries, red as her bonnet, looked so enticing that she popped almost as many into her mouth as she did into her basket. As for the flowers, there were so many that she scarcely knew where to choose. So she ran from one spot to another, trying to pick as many different colors as possible. It was only when she had gathered as many in her basket and hands could hold that she remembered her errand. By now, she had wandered so deep into the forest that she had to heed her step through the tangled bushes a little more carefully on the way back. And there were still things to distract her. A bushy-tailed squirrel didn't seem to mind such a little girl watching them bury a nut, then smooth the earth over their hiding place and their skillful paws. And what child could not have resisted chasing the prettiest orange-speckled yellow butterfly until it had fluttered out of reach, or not stopped to cock an eye and ear at a woodpecker tapping its sharp bill against the bark of a tree? Even when she was back once more on the familiar path, she still couldn't help dawdling a little, to watch a bird flapping its wings overhead or hopping about underfoot, to a sniff at a posy of a white, yellow bird, blue, red, and purple flowers. But eventually she reached her grandmother's cottage and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" called the wolf, trying hard this time to imitate the old lady's voice. "It's Little Red Riding Hood, Granny dear. I brought you a cake Mother baked for you and some wine to make better, and I picked some flowers and berries for you in the forest." "Lift the hatch and come right in, dear," the wolf called back as gently as they could. They had become rather impatient and cross as they waited, thinking that perhaps they had been altogether too wily for their own good, and that the little girl was going to cheat them of the juiciest part of their lunch by not coming. Little Red Riding Hood did as she was told, and easily lifted the simple latch. She always enjoyed coming to see her grandmother, but now as she crossed the threshold into the cottage, she suddenly felt disquieted, without really knowing why. Hesitating a moment, she squinted her eyes around the darkened room, surprised that her grandmother should want to keep the curtains closed and shut out the sparkling sunshine, which would surely cheer her up if she wasn't feeling well. Setting down her basket and the flowers, she tiptoed gingerly over to the large bed, and was just about to give her grandmother a kiss as usual, when she drew back a step with an uneasy start. "Why, Granny!" she exclaimed wonderingly. "What big ears you have!" "All the better hear you with, my dear," came the reply. The old lady's voice sounded rather croaky, but Little Red Riding Hood thought it must be of a cold. It was something much stranger about her grandmother that made her peer even more anxiously at the bed. "Why, Granny, what big eyes you have!" "All the better to see you with, my dear." The child's own eyes were by now almost as round as small owls. "Why, Granny, what enormous big hands you have!" "All the better to hold you with, my dear." "And oh, Granny, what terrible big teeth you have!" "All the better to eat you with, my dear." And with these ominous words, the wolf reached out their great claws, grabbed hold of Little Red Riding Hood, and gobbled her up in no time at all, licking their thick lips after each tender mouthful. Feeling very bloated indeed after such a scrumptious meal, they then stretched themselves out on to the full length of the bed, settled their head comfortably back on the pillow, and was soon sound asleep, snoring loudly enough to shake the rafters. A short while afterwards, a hunter, gun swinging from her shoulder, happened to pass that way. Thinking that something must be seriously wrong with the old lady to make her snore so raucously, she rapped on the door in case Granny should be in need of help. And when there was no answer, she too lifted the latch and let herself into the cottage. A few long strides brought her to the foot of the bed, where she was nearly startled out of her wits to discover the wolf lying there in the old lady's stead. "You're a rogue," she muttered to herself. "So I've got you at last. I've been on your trail long enough." And she whipped the gun off her shoulder and shot the wolf dead. It was only then that the hunter noticed not only that the wolf was wearing the old lady's night-clothes, but how fat they looked bulging there under the counterpane. "So that's where she is," she guessed out loud, and there being no sign of the old lady anywhere else, she pulled her hunting knife from her satchel and slit open the wolf's stomach from end to end. And out tumbled the old lady and Little Red Riding Hood, both of them still alive, although stiff from being so cramped, and obviously shaken by their frightened experience. It wasn't long, however, before the two of them recovered. The hunter sat the old lady in an armchair and wrapped a blanket around her. But once she had eaten 2 slices of the cake and drank a glassful of wine, Granny declared she didn't need fussing over any more, and was well enough to get dressed. The dress herself she did in her best pink dress, as if she were giving a party. "And it really is like a party," Little Red Riding Hood thought, nibbling at the cake she was sharing with her grandmother and the hunter. The porch of the cottage bloomed gaily with flowers, none gayer than her own posies arranged in a handsome pink bowl. No one had scolded her when the hunter slung the wolf over her shoulder and waved goodbye. Little Red Riding Hood felt she had made a new friend. But you can be sure that she never left the path or spoke to a stranger again. Puss in Boots, from Fairy Tales retold by Bridget Hathaway. There was once a poor miller, whose only possessions were his mill, a donkey, and a cat. When he died, his 3 sons shared them out as follows. The eldest son took the mill, the middle son the donkey, and the youngest son the cat. The youngest boy was quite dejected at the way their father's property had been divided, and felt that he had received a very poor share. "My brothers can go into any partnership and use the donkey to help work the mill. But what use is a cat?" he said to himself. "I could make it into a pie and sell its skin for a muff, but I don't want to kill it." The cat happened to have overheard his word, and spoke up at once. "Don't be sad, my good master," they said. "Just give me a sack and have a pair of boots made up for me, and you will soon see that you have better bargain than either of your brothers." The boy was so surprised to hear the cat talk that he was quite ready to believe it. So he went to the best shoemaker in the village and ordered a pair of boots in the softest leather. The cat was so pleased with them that they wore them all the time, which is how they got their name, Puss in Boots. Then the boy gave them the sack they had asked for, and Puss in Boots slung it over their shoulder and made for the woods to hunt rabbits. They put some bran and some lettuce into the sack and stretched themselves out beside it, pretending to be dead. They had barely closed their eyes when things began to happen exactly as they had planned. A plump young rabbit hopped out of the bushes, sniffed all around the sack, and then crawled inside it. In a flash, the cat drew the string tightly around the top, caught the rabbit, and killed it. Feeling very pleased with their trick had succeeded so quickly, Puss slung the sack over their shoulder again and set out for the palace. Once there, they demanded to see the king without delay, and the Funklings escorted them to the throne room. "Sire," they said, bowing low to the king, "I have brought you a young rabbit with my noble lord, the Marquis of Carabas," for that was the title they had just invented from the miller's son, "has commanded me to present to you your majesty." "Thank you, master," the king said graciously, "and tell them I am very pleased with his present." Another time, the cat hid in wheat fields and held their sack wide open. When a couple of partridges fluttered into it, they pulled the string tight and caught them fast. This, too, they presented to the king, who rewarded Puss suitably. Then one day, Puss overheard the courtiers saying that the king was planning to go for a drive along the river with his daughter, who was the most beautiful princess in the world. The cat ran back to its master and said, "If you do as I say, your fortune is made. All you have to do is go bathing in the river at the exact time and in the exact spot that I tell you. Leave the rest to me." The young man was very puzzled at this, but he decided to follow the cat's instructions because it was a hot, sunny day, and he liked swimming in the river anyway. While he was splashing about, the king came by in his carriage. At once the cat began to cry out, "Help! Help! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning! Help! Help!" As soon as the king heard this name, he ordered the carriage to be stopped and commanded his flunkies to run immediately to rescue the Marquis of Carabas. While they were dragging the boy out of the river, Puss in Boots came up to the carriage and told the king that while their master was bathing, some thieves had come and taken all their clothes away. In fact, the cunning cat had hidden them under a rock. The king immediately sent an officer off to the palace to fetch one of his best suits for the Marquis of Carabas. Once he was dressed in all these new clothes, the miller's son was transformed into such a handsome, noble-looking man that the princess instantly fell in love with him. She persuaded her father to invite him into the royal carriage to accompany them on their drive. Puss in Boots, who had watched all this with the greatest satisfaction, hurried off ahead of the royal party. Soon Puss came across some peasants mowing the meadow and said to them, "The king will be driving past soon. When he stops and asks you who owns this meadow that you are mowing, you had better say it belongs to my lord the Marquis of Carabas, for if you don't, you will be chopped into little pieces." Sure enough, the king ordered his carriage to stop and asked the mowers to whom the meadow belonged. "To my lord the Marquis of Carabas," the mowers answered with one voice, for the cat had almost scared them silly. The king turned to the young man and congratulated him on his fine, fertile lands. Meanwhile, the cat ran on ahead once again, and soon came across some reapers reaping a field. Again, Puss told them to say that the fields around belonged to the Marquis of Carabas, and again threatened them with the chopper if they did not. When the king came by a moment later and asked the woman who owned the land, they chorused obediently, "To my lord, the Marquis of Carabas," and the king once again complimented the young man by his side. Puss kept running ahead of the royal carriage, and as the king drove on through the countryside, he kept hearing all the same story. Finally, Puss in Boots came to a stately castle which was owned by an orc. In fact, It was she who owned all the lands that the king had been riding through. The cat asked to speak to her, saying that her fame had spread far and wide. The orc was very flattered at this and invited Puss in Boots to sit down. "I have heard much about your great skills," the cat went on, "and have been told that you are able to turn yourself into whatever you like. I have heard, for instance, that you can turn yourself into a lion, or an elephant, or some such wild animal." "Indeed I can," said the orc proudly. "I'll prove it. I shall show you now." With these words, she transformed herself into a lion, and let out a great roar which shook the castle walls. Puss in Boots was so frightened that they leaped onto the roof, which was a dangerous thing to do in their boots. Eventually, when the orc had resumed her natural form, Puss jumped down again. "Well, it scared me," they told the orc. "But I have also heard that you can take on the shape of tiny creatures, such as a mouse or a rat. I think that would be quite impossible." "Impossible? Nothing is impossible for me!" exclaimed the orc. And with that, she changed herself into a field mouse and began scampering around the floor. With one pounce, the cat caught her and ate her up. Meanwhile, the king had seen the castle in the distance and decided to pay a call on its owner. As the carriage rattled over the drawbridge, Puss hurried towards it. "Welcome to the castle of Marquis of Carabas," Puss called. And the king was delighted to hear that his friend lived in such a splendid place. The young man invited the king and the princess into the great hall, where a feast had already been prepared by the orc for her friends, who were now too scared to come in. When they had finished eating and drinking everything on the tables, the king proposed to the marquis that since he and the princess had obviously fallen in love, they ought to get married. This they promptly did, and lived happily ever after. As for Puss in Boots, they became a great lord, and never chased mice again, well, except for fun.
This is CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio, and you're listening to the national award-winning show, River Reads, hosted by narrator, River Wild. As a non-profit community radio station, we rely on our silver sponsors, like Mountain Eagle Books. Thank you, Mountain Eagle Books, for your invaluable support towards promoting local music and community radio. Now, let's continue with our scheduled programming.
The following is rated GGD, meaning it contains gross gore and/or death. Sensitive viewers may want to tune back in. The following is rated QM, meaning it may contain a questionable message. Those easily offended, or who do not want to engage in a possible involved discussion with your children, might want to tune back in.
Listeners' discretion is advised. Hansel and Gretel, from Fairy Tales, retold by Bridget Hathaway. Once upon a time, a poor woodcutter lived on the edge of a forest with her husband and 2 children. One was called Hansel and the other Gretel. They never had enough to eat, and as time went by, the whole country ran short of food, and the family began to starve. At last, all they had to eat were a few shriveled apples. There was not even so much as a crumb of bread left in the house. That night, when the woodcutter went to bed, they said to their husband, who was the children's stepfather, "What is to become of all of us? How can we live without food?" "We can't," he said. "Tomorrow morning we must take the children into the furthest part of the forest and leave them there while we go and collect wood to sell. They will never be able to find their way home again, and we shall only have ourselves to find food for." "No, husband," protested the woodcutter. "I can't leave my own children in the forest to be eaten by wild beasts." "If you don't, all 4 of us will die of hunger. And you just may as well go and start making our coffins now." And being mean man, he went on arguing until the last. She reluctantly agreed to his heartless plan. Now Hansel and Gretel had not been able to go to sleep because they were still so hungry, and they overheard what their stepfather said. Gretel was very frightened and began to cry. "We're going to die, Hansel," they wept. "Don't cry, Gretel. I'll find a way to help us," Hansel reassured them. Hansel waited until the mother and father had gone to sleep, and then they got out of bed, put on clothes, opened the door, and slipped out of the house. The moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles that lay in front of the house glittered like pieces of silver. Hansel bent down and filled their coat and trouser pockets with them. Then they went back to Gretel, who was still awake. "Don't worry, little one," they said, hugging them tight. "I'll see to it that we don't get lost in the forest." And they went to sleep with their arms around each other. At dawn, the stepfather came in and shook them awake. "Get up, you lazy bones. We're all going into the forest to fetch wood." He gave each of them 2 apples. "That's for your lunch," he said sourly. "It's all you get today." Gretel carried the apples, for Hansel had their pockets full of pebbles. After they had walked a little while, Hansel began to lag behind and kept looking back at the house. Their mother noticed this. "Why are you always looking behind you?" she asked Hansel. "You'll stumble and fall if you don't take more care." "I'm just looking at my white kitten, Mother," said Hansel quickly. "It's sitting on the roof and waving goodbye to me like it always does." "You fool!" scolded their stepfather. "That isn't your kitten. That's the sun shining on the chimney." But in fact, Hansel was laying a trail of pebbles on the path behind them. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the mother said, "We shall light a big fire here. You can keep it all light with the dry sticks on the ground." And when they had collected a large heap of those, and the flames began to take hold, she told them, "Now lie down by the fire, children, and rest. Your father and I are going further into the forest to cut more wood. When we have finished, we shall come back and fetch you." So Hansel and Gretel sat down near the fire and waited. They stoked it and waited. At lunchtime, they ate their apples. They could hear the sound of an axe in the distance and thought it was their parents falling trees. But it was not an axe that they heard. It was a branch the wind was blowing against a tree. They talked a little at first to cheer each other up, but after they had waited a very long time, their eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Finally, huddled together, side by side, they both fell fast asleep. When they woke up, it was completely dark, and the fire had gone out completely. "We shall never find our way out of this wood again," cried Gretel, beginning to weep. "Wait," said Hansel. "The moon will be up soon, and then we shall be able to see again." Once the moon had risen, Hansel took Gretel by the hand and followed the track of the pebbles, which shone like silver coins in the moonlight, leading them all the way back to their parents' house. They knocked at the door, and when the man answered it and saw Hansel and Gretel, he pretended that he had been expecting to see them. "You naughty children," he scolded. "Why did you sleep so long in the forest? We began to think you were never coming home." But then their mother was really glad to see them then, and hugged them close, for she had bitterly regretted leaving them behind. Not long afterwards, there was again great famine in the country, and once again there was no food for the woodcutter's house. That night the hungry children heard the stepfather say, "It's no good. The children will have to go. There's not enough food left to feed all of us." Again the mother argued and pleaded, and again he insisted on getting his way in the end. When their parents had gone to sleep, Hansel got out of bed and tried, as they had done before, to fill their pockets with pebbles. But this time their stepfather had bolted the door, and they could not get out. So they returned to Gretel and tried to comfort them. "Don't worry," they reassured them. "Sleep well now, for God will take care of us later." Next morning, the man woke the children at dawn, gave them each a crust of bread for lunch, and told them that they were going to collect wood in the forest again. On the way there, Hansel kept looking back at the house, and their mother asked them why they were so slow. "I'm looking at a little pigeon sitting on the roof," they answered. "That isn't a pigeon, idiot. That's the sun shining on the chimney," said the man. But in reality, Hansel was crumbling up the bread in their pocket and dropping it on the ground to mark the trail. This time they went even deeper into the forest than before. Again the parents lit a big fire and told the children to sit by it and wait while they went out to cut wood. "In the evening we shall come back and fetch you," the stepfather told Hansel and Gretel. At midday, Gretel shared their bread with Hansel, for they had strewn all of theirs along the trail. Then they fell asleep, and the sun set while they were still sleeping. When they awoke, it was quite dark. Gretel began to cry, and Hansel comforted them by saying, "The moon will be out again soon, Gretel, and then we shall see the breadcrumbs I scattered on the path. They will show us the way back to the house like the pebbles did before." But when the moon had risen, there were no breadcrumbs to be seen, because the birds and insects in the forest had eaten them all up. "Never mind," Hansel said bravely to Gretel. "We shall just have to find our own way out." By the third morning, they realized that they were completely lost. They seemed to be wandering in circles that led deeper and deeper into the forest. Feeling tired and hungry and frightened, they sat down on a log and wondered what to do next. Suddenly, they realized that a beautiful little snow-white bird was sitting on a branch above their heads, singing most sweetly. It seemed to be singing to them, encouraging them not to despair. Then it fluttered a little way off and seemed to be waiting for them. They rose and kept following it through the trees until they came to a little house in a clearing. It was no ordinary house, for its walls were built of honey bread and nuts. Its roof was tiled with sugar cakes, and its windows were made up of peppermint sticks. "Now we can eat all we want," they shouted. Hansel and he and Gretel began pulling off pieces of the roof and walls and stuffing them into their mouths. Then a voice called from inside, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse. Who is nibbling at my house? The wind, the wind, the heaven-born wind!" The children called back gaily, with their mouths crammed full. They had eaten a big chunk of the roof and were pulling out the window panes so that they could lick them more easily, when suddenly the door of the house opened, and an old woman came hobbling out, leaning heavily on a crutch. The children shrank back in terror, but instead of scolding them, she smiled at them and said sweetly, "My dears, how did you find your way here? Come inside. I will give you better food than this. Don't be afraid. No harm will come to you." She took the children's hands and led them into the kitchen, where a wonderful meal had already been prepared. On the table stood steaming hot pancakes with syrup and apples and nuts. When they had eaten their fill, the old woman let them out to a room with 2 cozy little white beds in it. Hansel and Gretel fell asleep that night, thinking they must surely have reached heaven. But the old woman was only pretending to be friendly. In reality, she was an evil witch, whose favorite food was little children. She had built the house of sugar and spice to entice children to visit her, and once they were in her power, she killed them, cooked them, and ate them. The witch had red eyes and could hardly see at all, but she could smell as well as a dog or wolf. When she had smelled Hansel and Gretel a long way off, she had laughed to herself at the prospect of such a tasty dish. At daybreak the next day, she went to the room where the children were sleeping peacefully, snatched up Hansel, and carried them kicking and struggling to the yard outside, where she locked them in a cage. Then she shook Gretel awake. "Get up, you lazy child," she shouted. "Fetch some water from the well in the yard to cook Hansel something good. I want going to be fattening them up, and when they are fat enough, I shall eat them." Gretel was terrified, but they had to do as they were told. Every day they cleaned the house and helped the witch cook huge meals for Hansel, while they themselves was only allowed to eat the scrapings from the bottom of the pot. Every morning the old witch hobbled out to the yard and cried out shrilly, "Hansel, stick your little finger through the bars so that I can feel how very nice and fat you're getting." But Hansel always slipped a chicken bone through the bars instead, and the witch, who could hardly see at all, pinched it, and couldn't understand why Hansel never grew any fatter. When a month had gone by and Hansel was still as thin as ever, despite all the good food she had been giving them, the old witch could wait no longer. "Go to the well," she ordered Gretel, "and fetch me a bucket of water. Whether Hansel is fat or thin, I'm going to boil them in a pot and eat them for my lunch tomorrow." Poor Gretel wept and begged that the witch not do it. "If only the wild beasts in the forest had eaten us, then at least we would have died together. Dear God, help us," they cried. "Hold your tongue," shouted the witch. "Crying won't help you." Early the next morning, Gretel had to go out and gather wood for the fire, and set the big pot of water on the stove to boil. They began to cry again, and when they thought about what the water was to be used for. "First we'll bake the bread," said the witch. "I have kneaded the dough and put it on the shelf to rise. Open the oven door and tell me if it's hot enough for me to put the bread in to bake." And she pushed Gretel towards the oven, intending to push them into it and bake them, so that they could eat them as well as Hansel. But Gretel had guessed her plan. "I don't know how to tell if the oven is hot enough. Will you show me, please?" they asked. "You silly goose, this is how you do it," said the witch impatiently, and she opened the oven door wide and bent over to feel the heat. Gretel gave her a push that toppled her right into the oven, and they slammed the door shut and bolted it. The witch yelled and screamed, but she could not get out, and was soon roasted to cinders. Gretel ran out of the yard and opened Hansel's cage, crying out, "Hansel will free! The old witch is dead!" Hansel jumped out into the yard, and they hugged one another and danced about, crying for joy. Then they went into the witch's house, where they found sacks and chests full of pearls and gold and precious stones. "These are much better than pebbles," said Hansel, stuffing the pockets of their jerkins and knickerbockers with them. "I'll take some too," said Gretel, and they filled their apronful. "Now let's get away from here as fast as we can," said Hansel. When they had wandered a while, they came to a river too broad for them to swim across. While they were wondering what to do with a white duck came swimming by, and Gretel asked it to carry them to the other bank, which it kindly did, taking first Gretel and then Hansel. On the far side of the river, the forest was less thick, and the children soon began to see trees and streams that they recognized. At last they caught sight of their house in their distance, and although they were very tired by now, they started to run. They ran all the way home and straight into their mother's arms. The poor woman had regretted her act 1,000 times over, and had grown thin and grey worrying of them. Their evil stepfather, fortunately, had died. "Look, mother, what we've brought you home," cried the children, and they heaped the witch's treasure onto the table, so that pearls and precious stones spilled in all directions. From that day onwards, all their troubles were over, and they lived happily together for many years.
The following is rated QM, meaning it may contain a questionable message. Those easily offended, or who do not want to engage in a possible involved discussion with your children, might want to tune back in.
Listeners' discretion is advised. Rapunzel, from Fairy Tales, retold by Bridget Hathaway. Once upon a time, a man and his wife lived in a small house, which lay close to a splendid garden that belonged to a witch. From their windows they could see rare herbs and flowers growing in the garden, but they never dared to pick any, for they knew that if they did, they would fall into the witch's power. One day, however, the wife fell ill with a fever, and it seemed certain that she would die. In her sickness, she longed for one thing only, the leaves of a herb called rampion, which grew in the witch's garden. Her husband, who loved her dearly, was ready to risk anything to save his wife, and so, at dusk, he climbed over the witch's garden's wall. he picked some of the leaves and returned safely with them to his wife, who ate them and recovered her strength. It was not long, however, before she fell ill again, and this time it was the root of a herb she wanted. At dusk, the husband again climbed over the wall and tried to pull the herb up by its root. Suddenly, he felt a burning pain in his hands and looked up. He saw the witch standing in front of him. "A curse on you," she cried, "for stealing the rampion from my garden." "My wife is ill, and will die without your herb," pleaded the man. But the witch had no mercy. "Go," she said, "but in exchange for the rampion you have stolen, I shall take your firstborn child. I shall come and collect it on the day that it is born." Not long afterwards, a daughter was born to the couple, and no sooner had she opened her eyes to the world than the witch appeared to claim her, as she had declared she would. In their rejoicing at the birth of the child they had so ardently awaited, the couple had pushed to the back of their minds the harsh demand the witch had made of the husband, and they begged her now to let them keep their small daughter. But neither tears nor entreaty had any effect on the merciless witch, who, impatient to be off, picked up the child and carried her ruthlessly away. From the start, she called her Rapunzel, which is another name for rampion. Years passed, and Rapunzel grew up to be the loveliest creature in the world. When she was 12, the witch locked her into a tower in the depth of a forest surrounded by mountains. The tower had neither stairs nor door. The only way into it was through Rapunzel's window high up in the wall, which, when the witch wanted to visit her, she would call up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." The girl had wonderfully long golden hair, which she would twist into thick plait and wind around the window bar so that it dropped clear down to the ground, and the witch could use it as a rope to climb up. A prince who had lost his way in the forest came riding past the tower one evening. As he drew near, he heard the loveliest voice he had ever heard singing, and he stopped to listen. It was Rapunzel singing to herself in her loneliness. Then he heard the witch's voice call up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." He saw the thick coils of golden hair let down from the tiny window. The witch climbed up and disappeared from view. The prince was determined to see the girl who sang so sweetly, so he waited until the witch had gone, and then he called up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." At once, the golden rope swung down the tower wall to him, and he climbed up. As soon as he saw Rapunzel's beauty, he fell in love with her, and he asked her to become his wife. Rapunzel, who had never seen anyone but the old witch, was delighted by this handsome man, and agreed to escape with him. She said, "Every time you come to see me, you must bring a skin of silk, and I will plant it into a ladder as thick as my hair, and then we can climb down and ride away together." The prince came to see her every evening, because the witch visited her during the daytime. The day of their escape was drawing near when Rapunzel, who could think of nothing but her prince, said dreamily to the witch, "Why is it, good dame, that you are so much heavier to pull up than my prince?" Thus the witch learned that Rapunzel had deceived her, and she flew into a rage. She cut off Rapunzel's long hair and tied it to the window bars. Then she carried the girl into a distant valley and left her alone to live in misery. That evening, the prince came and called to his beloved as usual. Her hair came tumbling down to him, and he climbed up into the tower. But this time it was the witch who pulled him in, cursing him as she did. "She is gone," she cried. "You will never see her again." With that, she threw the young man out of the window into the forest below. He fell into a thicket of briars, and the thorns scratched his eyes and blinded him. He wandered, blind and sad, through the forest and over the mountains, weeping for his beloved. One day, at last, he came to the valley where Rapunzel was living. As soon as she saw him, she ran to him, weeping, and her tears fell on his eyes and healed them, so that he could see again as well as ever. Then the prince took Rapunzel to his kingdom, where they married and lived the rest of their days in complete happiness. Gender Blender. This week's River Reads Gender Blender tale were in fact 3 tales: Puss in Boots, Little Red Riding Hood, and Hansel and Gretel.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the radio station and any entities they represent. In addition, the stories, and any possible twisted messages relayed, do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the host, twisted as they are and despite what they might tell you, or the radio station, or their affiliates, or any entities they represent, and solely are those of the author, if even that, for that matter. Also, just now, I'm referring to the host being twisted, not the station being twisted, even if they happen to be so, and that's all I'm saying about that.
As a non-profit, we rely on sponsors like Smithers Brewing Company. Thank you, Smithers Brewing Company, for supporting local community radio.
This is CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio. You have been listening to River Reads, with host River Wild. For more River Reads, tune in weekly every Saturday at 10 a.m., and Sundays at 9 a.m. See you then.